On Reimagining Soviet Georgia, one of the themes that we regularly revisit is the relationship between history and memory politics. In countries across the former Soviet Union, there's no shortage of tension between the two. Since 2014, when the Maidan uprising took place in Ukraine, the figure of Stepan Bandera has emerged as one of the most controversial planes of politicized historical memory throughout the entire post-Soviet space. Though reverence for Bandera and the existence of a Bandera cult have a long history in Western Ukraine, there has also been a formidable anti-Bandera sentiment in southern and eastern Ukraine. During the Soviet Union, Bandera and Ukrainian nationalists were demonized by the Soviet state at large. However, the figure took on a new political resonance after 2014. The writer, politician, and nationalist activist Stepan Bandera, and along with it the right-wing nationalists and World War II-era Nazi collaborators in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian Insurgent Army, became actively mobilized by segments of the population as a counter-memory to Ukraine's Soviet past and along with it, Russia today. This helped facilitate a further deification of Bandera as a Ukrainian national hero, both at the state and popular levels. Such a memory mobilization had a dual and seemingly contradictory effect. On one hand, it sanitized the history of Ukrainian right-wing nationalism and helped embolden far-right politics in Ukraine. But it also fueled the revanchist national memory regime of the Russian Federation. As fighting began in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and tensions continued to increase between Russia and Ukraine, leading to the 2022 full-scale invasion, the government of the Russian Federation actively singled out the Ukrainian far-right, far from representing the entire population, such as those in the Azov battalion, and the nationalist memory cult around Stepan Bandera as justification for one of Russia's stated objectives, denazifying Ukraine. The catastrophic results are now self-evident. One result of the simultaneous deification and sanitization of Bandera by nationalists in Ukraine and his pointed demonization by the government of the Russian Federation has been to muddy the actual historical record of Bandera, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and interwar Ukrainian nationalism in general in service of contemporary memory politics. In the context of war, many have sought to distance themselves from critiquing or engaging with this past critically, to the detriment of historical clarity. On today's episode, we hope to clarify to the extent possible the historical record of Bandera and interwar Ukrainian nationalism, as well as its consequences for post-Soviet memory politics in Ukraine. To do so, we welcome Grigor Rosolinsky-Liebe, historian from the Free University of Berlin and author of the meticulous study Stepan Bandera, The Life and Afterlife of a Ukrainian Nationalist, Fascism, Genocide, and Cult. Gregor Rosolinsky-Liebe, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Thank you for inviting me. So I am a historian. I work at the Freie Universität Berlin. In Berlin, I study the Holocaust, fascism, transnational fascism, the history of anti-Semitism, and I published a biography of Stepan Bandera about 10 years ago. It was my PhD. This is the first comprehensive and academic biography of this person. In the last years, I worked on another comprehensive book. It was the biography of Polish mayors during the Holocaust in the general government.
And just for our listeners, could you just tell us, how did you get interested in this topic of Stepan Bandera and Ukrainian nationalism and transnational fascism?
I think there were many reasons. I was interested in the history of Ukraine in general. And then part of my family is from Ukraine, from Western Ukraine. So I knew from my grandmother who the Ukrainian nationalists were, and I had the name Bandera. And I was in general interested in the history and in the history of the Holocaust, in the history of Eastern Europe. And as I studied 20 years ago in the European University Viadrina, I made a semester abroad in Lviv at the Ivan Franko University in Lviv. And then I was confronted with the cult of Stepan Bandera. And then I started to read about Bandera. And what I discovered were very political depictions of Bandera. So I discovered the Soviet narrative of Bandera, the post-communist nationalist narrative in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, and also some Polish nationalist writings about Bandera. And then reading more on the subject, I discovered what the Jewish historians have to say about Bandera, especially the early Jewish historians like Philip Friedman, who survived the Holocaust in Western Ukraine. What did they write about the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Holocaust? It were people who survived the Holocaust in Western Ukraine, so they made immediate experience with the Ukrainian nationalists. And then thinking about writing a PhD later, I decided to write it about Bandera. And then I did a thorough research of the subject. So I work in most of the archives who have documents about Bandera or on the Ukrainian nationalists, went through the documents. And after this, I wrote the biography of Bandera. And it was the question of writing the biography was if it should be more on the memory or if it should be more on the history. At the beginning, I thought it should be more on the memory. The memory is a very interesting subject. Bandera is so controversial, very different understood in Poland or in Russia than in Ukraine. And then researching the subject, I understood that you can understand memory of a person like Bandera or another person only if you actually understand the history, if you know what happened, what the person did during their life. And it was the big challenge to write the biography of Bandera, to actually find out what he did not, who he was, what his aims were, how he behaved in these years, how he behaved in these years. Did he invent Ukrainian fascism? Did he not do it? How was he involved in the Holocaust? So I had first to answer all this question to reconstruct what he did before the war, during World War II, after the war, to could study the memory of this person. Because without having a biography, the knowledge of who he was, it would be not possible really to understand the memory of this person.
So before we kind of address this question of the relationship between memory and history, could you just give our audience the background of who was Stepan Bandera and what world did he come from? Because in your book, Stepan Bandera, The Life and Afterlife of a Ukrainian Nationalist, you do a very good job of kind of contextualizing that there was a political ecosystem and a background to this figure. So for our audience, could you just say, like, who was he and where did he come from?
Yeah, so Stepan Bandera was born in 1909 in the Habsburg Empire, what is today Western Ukraine. And then he was born in the family of a Greek Catholic priest. It is a United Ukrainian Church. So his father was as a priest, a nationalist. And then as a young man, he watched in front of his house how the Ukrainians were fighting against each other. So in the Habsburg army and Ukrainians in the Russian army. And in his youth, he became a radical nationalist and also a person who was impacted by the transnational fascism, which is very common in Europe at the time, and also a person who started to create a form of Ukrainian fascism. And he first joined the Ukrainian military organization as he was at a gymnasium, at high school in Stry, a town not far away where he was born. and then he joined the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was a radical nationalist Ukrainian organization founded by the veterans, Ukrainian veterans of World War I. And these people tried to involve a younger generation, so the Bandera generation born shortly before World War I, so people who did not fight in World War I, but people who wanted to establish a state like them. And what they achieved was actually to create a small mass movement in the underground of the Polish state, so the southeastern territories of Poland. And they fought for a Ukrainian state, and they used very radical methods. So they killed Polish officials, they killed Ukrainians who wanted to have peace with Poland, or were Democrats or communists. They killed Russian bureaucrats. They were also very anti-Semitic, and then they created an ideology which combined a radical form of Ukrainian nationalism and created a form of Ukrainian fascism. And they regarded the same as themselves as a Ukrainian fascist movement. But in public, very important, it's very important, they didn't call themselves fascists, they called themselves nationalists. So they knew that they belonged to the transnational, international family of fascists. They know that they are closely related to the Italian fascists, closely related to the National Socialists. They had good relations with the Ustasha, so with the Croatian fascist movement. But at the same time, in public, they mostly, almost always said, we are the Ukrainian nationalists. It is more important to be nationalist, and we do not present ourselves as the fascists, although they knew that they are fascists and behave like fascists and invented a fascist ideology. And Bandera became the face and the leader of the younger generation, so the generation which controlled the OUN in Poland. After the assassination of the Polish minister Bronisław Pieracki in Warsaw in 1935, Bandera was arrested, and many other members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were arrested, and Bandera spent the last 4 years before World War II in prison, where he radicalized other Ukrainian nationalists. So in the middle of the 1930s, Bandera, the name of Bandera was common in Ukraine. He was regarded as the leader of the younger generation of the Ukrainian nationalists. And as World War II started in September 1939, he broke out from prison, and then he engaged in the politics again. So the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, split into the OUN-B, Stepan Bandera, it was the younger generation, and OUN-M, Andriy Melnik, it was the older generation. Bandera was the leader of the younger generation. The fascistization of the organization went on. And it is important at the moment to say what the aims of the OUN were, the political aims of the OUN were of both factions. And the most important aims was to create a Ukrainian state, to create an ethnically homogeneous Ukrainian state, which means a state in which only ethnic Ukrainians would live. And this was a huge challenge for them, because Ukraine was a multi-ethnic space. So there were many Jews, many Poles, many Russians in Ukraine. And they wanted.
And can I just ask? I'm sorry, really quickly, just to clarify for our listeners. You mentioned in your book that there was this sort of at least ideological shift that happened within Ukrainian nationalism, where the writings of, you mentioned Dontsov in particular as being this influence upon Bandera and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, where they sort of move away from what could be seen as some kind of like civic nationalism into something that's more ethnically based, anti-Semitic, racist, and like exclusionary. And I'm just curious, like, how did, just before you move on, like, how did that shift happen where the Bandera generation became more committed to a fascistic view of Ukrainian nationalism?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it is this happened in Ukraine and other countries, other European countries, just after World War I. So before World War I, we have a more social form of nationalism. or even democratic form of nationalism in Ukraine and in other countries in Europe. And after World War I, the nationalism in Ukraine and other countries radicalized, and at least a part of this radical nationalism went further and became fascist or fascistic, as you want. And yeah, Dontsov was an important ideologist of the Ukrainian nationalists. He didn't join the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, but we had a huge impact on the Ukrainian, especially on the Bandera generation. And he was one of the person who condemned people like Ivan Franko or Khrushchevsky, who said they were not radical enough. We now need another form of nationalism, anti-Semitic, fascist, a very military form of nationalism. That is what he said after World War I. And at the end, this was what the OUN wanted. So the main aims, political aims of the OUN were to create an ethnically homogeneous Ukrainian state, so a state without Jews, without Poles, without Russians. And actually they had two methods. They wanted to remove the Jews, the Poles, and Russians in two ways from Ukraine, either to expel them, to force them to leave Ukraine, or to kill them. And they were discussing these two methods of either expelling or killing, as they call them, enemies of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian state, already in the middle of the 1930s. And this is actually what they started to do during World War II. So as World War II began, Bandera left the prison, the OUN split, and Bandera and his fraction invented a plan how to establish a Ukrainian state. So they elaborated very, very sophisticated plans, very detailed plans, how to establish a Ukrainian state. So it is 1939, 1940. 1940, beginning of the 1941, they collaborated at the time with the Wehrmacht, so with the German military, created their own military units, so German units with Ukrainian soldiers, and they prepared the underground in Ukraine how to establish a Ukrainian state after when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And they were involved in the Operation Barbarossa. They knew when the Operation Barbarossa starts, and they wanted to create a Ukrainian state after the attack on the Soviet Union. And they had very detailed plans, and the plans said establish a state, establish a fascist state, remove the enemies of the Ukrainian state, so the Jews, the Poles, and the Russians, either to expel them or to kill them. They wanted first to proclaim the state in Lviv, what they did, and later in Kiev. And Bandera should become the providnik. Providnik means the leader, so something like the Führer or Duce in Ukrainian, the Führer of the state.
You talk about how there was this when Operation Barbarossa started and the Soviet Union was going to be invaded, and that the Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine, specifically the OUNB, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists involved Bandera, had this interesting relationship with Germany that I was maybe hoping you could at least touch on at this point, because what was interesting to read was that on the one hand, the Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine believed that with a German invasion, that they would be able to declare independent statehood, and that this Bandera faction's view of a so-called national revolution could take place, and that the Germans would basically facilitate that. But then you also sort of explain in your history of this that the Germans were not very fond of the OUNB, despite the fact that as you've also pointed out, they basically had huge overlap, if not indistinguishable ideologies. I mean, they were, of course, a little bit different, but they were very, very similar. So just like for the sake of understanding, how would you describe this relationship between the Ukrainian nationalists, their desire for German patronage, Nazi patronage, ideological affinity, and then the Germans, because of various political reasons, basically not willing to recognize their state in the same way that they recognize the Croatian or Slovak fascist regimes?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question to understand Bandera. Yeah, exactly. It is a complex relationships. So, yeah, in terms of ideology, as you said, ON was similar to the Nazis. It was a fascist movement. There were differences. For example, most important one would be that the Nazis had already a state. Germany was a state. They only had to take power in the state to have a fascist regime. The Ukrainian nationalists first had to establish a state to could establish a fascist regime. So this was the most biggest difference, and it was similar in the case of Ukraine. It was similar to Croatia or Slovakia. So Slovakia was also not a state. Croatia was also not a state. Was a part of Yugoslavia, and they succeeded. But it were different geopolitical reasons which helped them. So Hitler agreed to divide Czechoslovakia and to create Slovakia in 1938, and he agreed to establish a Croatian state, so to divide Yugoslavia, split Yugoslavia, and to create a Croatian state. But he had very different plans towards the territories, which he wanted to release from the Soviet occupation in 1941. So he did not want to have any states, any national states in these territories. So he did not agree to establish a Lithuanian state, a Latvian state, or a Belarusian state. And it is the most important reason why he did not agree to have a Ukrainian state. So what the ONB did, they just proclaimed the state in Lviv. They established administrations in the towns, in the cities, in the villages in Western Ukraine, and they hoped that Hitler will accept what they did. So they presented them with the fact that there is a Ukrainian state. They established a Ukrainian state, and they asked him to recognize the state. But he didn't change his plans. He said, no, there will be no Ukrainian state, as there will be no Belarusian or Lithuanian state. And then he decided to detain Bandera, to detain Stesko, who proclaimed the state, and to detain some other leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And it is the beginning of it was I would say, misunderstanding, but it was also a shock for the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They didn't expect to be arrested and to put into the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, or to sit in the jails in Berlin. They were regarded as special political prisoners. But they didn't really change their plans. So they knew at the moment that there will be no Ukrainian state with Bandera as the leader, but they wanted to realize some of their other political aims. So they wanted to clean Ukraine of the Jews, of the Poles, of the Russian, and they did it with the help of the Germans. So the OUN sent the people into the Ukrainian police, which helped the Germans to clean Western Ukraine of the Jews. And Western Ukraine, so Galicia and Volhynia, Eastern Galicia and Volhynia is a small territory of Ukraine. It's something like 20 or 30% of the entire Ukraine. But the half of the Jews who were killed in Ukraine were killed in this small territory. So 800,000 Jews were killed in Western Ukraine, another 800,000 were killed in Central and Eastern Ukraine, which is something like 80% of the Ukrainian state. And the Ukrainian police and the Ukrainian administration was involved in the Holocaust in Western Ukraine, and the OUN was involved as well. It was they sent the people to the police because they knew that they can help the Germans to kill the Jews, and in this way to have an ethnically clean Ukraine, so in Ukraine without Jews.
You just very eloquently described this relationship between the Ukrainian nationalists and the Germans at the time, the Nazi regime. But another really important part of your book that I think deserves its own explanation is the fact that this sort of radical Ukrainian nationalism really germinated in the Second Polish Republic, and that the sort of Ukrainian nationalist and Polish relationship, I think sometimes in the common imaginary, we think of this Ukrainian nationalism in regards to Russia, in regards to the Soviet Union. But, one of the sort of key elements of your book is that when we think about these sort of this historical, cultural, and linguistic division of Ukraine within Ukrainian nationalism that also kind of exists. And so I'm just wondering if you could just give our listeners a little bit of this Ukrainian Polish dimension and its role in kind of creating and facilitating politically the emergence of the OUN and sort of radical Ukrainian nationalism of the interwar period.
Yeah. The Polish context is very important for the OUN because the OUN existed and functioned actually only in the part of Ukraine which was in Poland, so in the Second Polish Republic. OUN was not known in Soviet Ukraine. So the 80% of the Ukrainian territory, which was in the Soviet Union, Soviet Ukraine, the people did not know there what is the OUN, who is Stepan Bandera, because the media, the papers in the Soviet Union, they didn't write anything about Bandera or the OUN. But the people in Poland, they knew very well who is Stepan Bandera. They were confronted with the Ukrainian nationalists. And it is the Polish context is important, and the Polish nationalism is important for the understanding of the OUN. The Poles, so a part of Ukraine, what is today Western Ukraine, Eastern Galicia and Volhynia, it was at the time after World War I, it was a part of Poland. There was no Ukrainian state. So something like 20% of Ukraine was in Poland after World War I, and 80% was in Russia, the Soviet Ukraine, and the OUN existed mainly in Poland to some extent, also in Czechoslovakia and in Romania, but the headquarters of the OUN was in Poland, and it was the Polish police who arrested the Ukrainian nationalists and who sent them to jail, and the same with Bandera after the assassination of the Polish Interior Minister Bronisław Piracki. And it was a clash of two nationalism, of the Polish nationalism, of the Ukrainian nationalists. They all, so both sides say Western Ukraine is a part of our state. The Ukrainian say it is a part of Ukraine, and Polish people say no, it is a part of Poland. And during World War II, we have something like a Polish-Ukrainian conflict. So sometimes it is called conflict, sometimes it is called ethnic cleansing, and ethnic cleansing is actually a better description of what happened. We could call it a Polish-Ukrainian conflict when we regard this in a longer way, so something which began after World War I, because there were fights between the Poles and the Ukrainians for the Ukrainian territories, and Ukrainians lost these fights, and this continues during World War II. But actually, after the Jews were killed in late 1942 and early 1943, the Ukrainian policemen left the Ukrainian police. The OUN members who were in the Ukrainian police left the Ukrainian police, and they joined the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So Ukraińska Powstańska Armia.
The Ukrainian police, when you say Ukrainian police, you're talking about the German deputized Ukrainian police forces, not a police force that was entirely related to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, right? The Ukrainian OUNB was just infiltrating or integrating itself within it, but the police forces were actually deputized by the Germans. Is that correct?
Exactly. It was the police of the district Galician in the general government. So it was a police controlled by the Germans, or the police in Reichskommissariat Ukraine. So a police controlled by the Germans, founded by the German, a police force of the general government. And in district Galician, so in Western Ukraine and in the western part of Reichskommissariat Ukraine, in Volhynia, only Ukrainians were in the police. So in the western parts of the general government, we have a Polish police. And in this part of district Galician, we have only Ukrainians in the police, in the German police. It is why it is called the Ukrainian police. So there were no Poles in this police, and it was actually called in the documents the Ukrainian police, Ukrainische Polizei. And it is why I call them the Ukrainian police. And established by the Germans, and the OUN tried to control this police and send their own members and to realize their own aims, which was the killing of the Jews. And then when the OUN founded the the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, in late 1942, in early 1943, the Ukrainian, the OUN members in the Ukrainian police left the police and they joined the UPA. And at the time, in early 1943, they started to kill the Poles. So there were almost no Jews in Ukraine because they were killed by the German occupiers and the Ukrainian police and the Ukrainian administration. And at the time, late 1942, early 1943, we have actually a Ukraine without the Jews. There are a few hundred Jews in Ukraine.
And you mentioned that the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, UPA, was founded in 1943.
Yeah, it's in early 1943 or late 1943. It regards how we do.
Right, and I just want to I think importantly for context that when the Ukrainian Insurgent Army is founded by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and then they, as your book mentions, they go on to murder somewhere between 70 to 100,000 Poles in this territory. I'm curious, what is the UPA's relationship with the German state at this time?
Yes. Yeah. So they are expelling the Poles. They are killing the Poles in 1943 in Volhynia and 1944 in Galicia, and the relation with the Germans is complex because there is no Ukrainian state, and they want it. The leaders of the OUN are in jails or are in the concentration camps. They are kept as special political prisoners of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, so the security forces of the German Reich, and the UPA. Yeah, it is a complex situation because in the official publications they write that the enemies are the Soviets, the Germans, and the Poles, and that they fought against these three forces. But when we look at the actual history of the UPA, we see only that they actually fight against the Soviet partisans. They expel and kill the Poles, and they hunt for the Jews who are hiding in the countryside or in the forests. They did not actually fight against there were some battles between them and the Germans, but it was not a priority or an important aim to fight against the Germans, because they knew that the Red Army will come to Western Ukraine, and that Ukraine will include into the Soviet Union. And the main force who could weaken the Red Army were the Germans. So they didn't really, I mean, in terms of ideology, in terms of the official publications, they did it because they wanted also to unite with the Allied forces. So they knew since early 1943, 1944, they knew that they need new ally, that they have to ally now with the USA, with Great Britain, with the Western forces to fight against the Soviet Union. But at the same time, they also knew that they should not fight against Nazi against the Wehrmacht, because Wehrmacht is fighting against the Red Army. So it is a complex situation.
You know, you've mentioned, of course, a number of times just the fact that one of the goals of the OUN and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in this interwar period was to remove non-Ukrainians from the imagined territorially imagined Ukraine. And could you just give a little bit of a description of how the Ukrainian nationalists of this period imagined this threat of Judeo-Bolshevism? Because the reason I'm interested in this, because the reason, as far as I understand, that the Ukrainian nationalists were opposed to Jews and wanted to liquidate Jews was this association of them with the Soviet Union, and sort of this in the ideology viewing Jews, Bolshevism, and communism as sort of being interlinked, and that the anti-communist nationalism of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that the anti-communism and the anti-Semitism were basically not only interrelated, but like mutually constitutive. They were reliant on each other. They built each other. That you couldn't have the anti-Semitism without the anti-communism. And so, why did that come into being, and where did that come from? And how did that become so important to the ideological vision and become so deadly to the Ukrainian nationalists of the interwar period?
Yeah, it is a good point. Yeah, it is very interesting in the Ukrainian case because it is Jewish Bolshevism. It is this conspiracy is a part of all discourses actually in around the world. But it is very interesting in the Ukrainian case, especially in the case of the Ukrainian nationalists. So after World War One, so 80% of the Ukrainian territories are included into the Soviet Union. It is the Soviet Ukraine. Actually, before that, so during the entire 19th century, 80% of the Ukrainian territories are in the Russian Empire, and the Russians, they Russified the Ukraine. So they were time, not all the time, but there were periods of time when they did not allow to speak Ukrainian in Russia, when they forbade to publish in Ukrainian, when they established only Russian schools. So this anti-Russian sentiment was very, I mean, it is difficult because this anti-Russian sentiment, it was not strong in this part of Ukraine in which actually Ukraine was Russified. It was strong in the part of Western Ukraine when there was no Russian imperialism. And it is why the Ukrainian nationalists were so extremely anti-Russian. The self-understanding of the Ukrainians in Central and Eastern Ukraine, so these people who lived in the Russian Empire or in the Soviet Union, so Soviet Ukraine, it was not anti-communist. I mean, some elites of these people were nationalists and they were anti-communist, but the general understanding of these people was not anti-Russian or anti-Soviet. It were the Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine who were extremely anti-Russian and anti-Soviet. So people like Dmytro Dontsov, you mentioned him before, he was extremely anti-Russian. And interestingly, before World War One, he was a communist. So he changed entirely his views, and after World War One, so became an extreme nationalist and a fascist. Yes, and it is an interesting question. How much anti-Russian, or if they were more anti-Russian than anti-Jewish, and there is no clear answer to this question because they were both. They viewed both. They viewed the Russian Empire. We can put this in this way: the Russian Empire was the most important political enemy next to Poland because it occupied Ukraine, and Jews, Poles, and Russians were the actual enemies. So the people they wanted to expel or kill in Ukraine to have ethnically homogeneous state, and it was obviously a part of the ideology for the entire time.
You kind of mentioned this in your last answer, but if you could just maybe expand on this a little bit, what did the Ukrainian nationalists of the interwar period, how did they view these areas of quote unquote Russified Ukraine, which would then become Soviet Ukraine? How did they understand or conceptualize both the territorial imagination of Ukraine in this so-called Russian Ukraine and then Soviet Ukraine? And how did they understand who those people were? Were they authentic Ukrainians? Were they part of their national imaginary? Were they somehow outside of it? Like, how did they conceptualize this?
Yeah, this is another good question because we had and we have today actually two Ukraines. We have Western Ukraine and we have the Central and Eastern Ukraine, and these two territories are very different. So during World War One, two Ukrainian states were proclaimed. In 1917, a Ukrainian state was proclaimed in November 1917 in Kiev, and then a year later, in November 1918, a Ukrainian state was proclaimed in Lviv. And the people who proclaimed the states, they were different kind of nationalists or different kind of politicians. In general, they wanted to have one Ukrainian state, but in practice, they proclaimed and tried to establish two different Ukrainian states. And the people who lived during the 19th century in Habsburg Ukraine, in Galicia, they had a very different self-understanding than the people in Central and Eastern Ukraine. They spoke Ukrainian, they were generally Ukrainian national or Ukrainian nationalistic. And the people in Central and Eastern Ukraine, they did not have this. Many of them spoke Russian, some speak Ukrainian, and they had more friendly relation to Russia, so that the virtues and the ideals and the aims of these people were different. And then when the OUN aims to establish a Ukrainian state, in terms of territory, it should be a Ukrainian state as it is today. So it should include all the territories of Ukraine, but they actually have had a realistic understanding only of Western Ukraine. So they knew how to establish administration, how to take control in Western Ukraine, because they knew the mentality of these people in Western Ukraine, and they could do this. But they in Eastern Ukraine and Central Ukraine, the reaction to the OUN was very different. So there were hostile reactions to the OUN as they came in 1941. So many people wonder if these are Ukrainians, if these are other people, what they want. And if they say that they are fascists or radical nationalists, they said you are Nazis. So they couldn't really act in Central and Eastern Ukraine. They wanted to have a Ukrainian state which would include all Ukrainian territories, and the capital would be in Kiev. But they did not know how to do this, because they had no they did not have the knowledge how to deal with the Central and Eastern Ukrainians. And later we have also the situation in the UPA where they kill people from Central and Eastern Ukraine because they are afraid of them. They think they are communists. They want to betray them. So the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists actually was able to establish a state in Western Ukraine, but they did not have the political knowledge and the experience to establish a state in Kiev and in Eastern Ukraine.
So after the Sovietization of Western Ukraine, I know that the Ukrainian Insurgent Army fights against the USSR in some capacity. Could you just give a little bit of outline? What was that dynamic between the post-World War II Sovietization of, no, I should say, post-World War II context of the relationship between the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Soviet Union, and maybe even in now communist Poland?
Yeah. This is another important part of the story. Yeah, there is a very brutal conflict between the Ukrainian nationalists and the Soviet forces since 1944. So from 1944, as the Red Army came in the summer of 1944 in Western Ukraine, until the early 1950s, because the UPA is in the underground. They are fighting against the Red Army and then the Soviet police. And they try to involve the Ukrainian population into this conflict. And in the beginning, they are supported by the Ukrainian population, but it changes quite quickly. Because the population in Western Ukraine realized that the UPA is not able to win this conflict, and they start to support the Soviet troops, or they are neutral. And they are very many victims during this conflict. So the UPA on themselves and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, they killed something like 100,000 Poles, expelled more than 100,000 from Western Ukraine, and they were involved in the murder of 800,000 Jews with the Germans. But the Soviet troops, the Red Army and the Soviet police, they kill 150,000 people in Western Ukraine. Since between 1944 and the early 1950s, and they expel 200,000 people from Western Ukraine, because this is how they liquidated the Ukrainian nationalist underground, and they targeted the families of the OUN members, of the UPA fighters, and the population in Western Ukraine suffered enormously during this conflict, because on the one hand there was the UPA, which tried to involve them into the conflict and regarded the collaboration with the Soviets as treason, and killed people who were, for example, heads of villages or mayors, or were in some way involved into the administration, work in the administration, or work as teachers in Western Ukraine. And on the other hand, there were the Soviets who were fighting against the UPA and who expelled the families of the Ukrainian nationalists and expelled also many random people who were accused of supporting the Ukrainian nationalists. So the Ukrainian population in Western Ukraine suffered enormously during this conflict between 1944 and the early 1950s. Bandera was involved in this conflict as well, because he was at the time in Munich. So after World War II, he was released from the prison in 1944. In late 1944, in the autumn of 1944, he went to Vienna for a short time. Then he went to Munich, established an organization, Ukrainian organization, with the help of the secret services, with the British Secret Service, MI6, and with the American Secret Service in Munich. And he trained Ukrainians who stayed in Munich in the camps for the displaced persons and sent them to Ukraine. And he supported this conflict until the very end. So he even was so his opinion and the opinion of other Ukrainian nationalists in Munich and in the diaspora was to use a nuclear weapon to fight against the Soviet Union. So they prolonged this conflict, and this contributed to the suffering of the people in Western Ukraine.
Great. So after World War II, obviously, we have this now more or less stable Soviet Ukraine. And we have, of course, the emergence of a growing and highly nationalist Ukrainian diaspora, which of course existed before. But I'm curious about what was the cult of Stepan Bandera in the Cold War period after World War II, and what role did the Ukrainian diaspora, those who had either participated directly in the OUN and the UPA, or those who were just sympathizers or anti-Soviet nationalists of various kinds, what role would they play in the facilitation of the Bandera cult? And one of the reasons I'm interested in this question is because, one thing that happens in the Cold War, I think, for various Soviet nations is that they have this nationhood that's externalized and contested to the Soviet version of it, that, of course, the Soviet state in various ways views as a threat. And I'm curious if you could just explain this Bandera cult, Cold War Ukrainian nationalism, and the role of the diaspora.
Another important question. So as I mentioned, diaspora Bandera was released in late 1944. He helped the Germans to mobilize Ukrainians to fight against the Soviet Union in early 1945, and then he went to Vienna and then to Munich, and he established a Ukrainian center with the help of the secret services. And the Soviets, KGB, tried to kill him or to arrest him and bring him to the Soviet Union. And they were sending agents, are actually already started to send agents already in 1945 to Munich. They knew where he lived, to arrest him or to kill him. But he had good security service, and he was killed only in 1959 by Bogdan Stashinsky, who was a KGB agent from Western Ukraine. And after he was killed, his cult reappeared again. And it was the Ukrainian diaspora who was involved in the creation or recreation of his cult. It were people who left Ukraine in 1944 with the Germans, so people who served in the SS Galician Division, or people who were Ukrainian policemen or work in the administration, or who decided in 1944 to leave Ukraine with the Germans and go to Germany. And they stayed in the DP camps in Germany, in Austria. They were resettled in the late 1940s and 1950s to Australia, to UK, to the States. And they took control of the Ukrainian diaspora centers in Toronto, in New York, in Washington, in other places, because the Ukrainians who lived before in these places were not political people. They came because of economic reasons to the States or to the UK. And these people who left Ukraine in 1944 with the Germans were very political. And when Bandera was killed in 1959 in Munich, they started to use this murder, this assassination, to mobilize Ukrainians to fight against the Soviet Union, and even people who didn't really know who was Bandera, who did not necessarily support his aims or were not in the movement, started to regard him as a Ukrainian hero, as a man who fought for Ukraine, who fought for Ukraine, was an important Ukrainian leader. And they elaborated a very interesting sort of the Bandera cult. So they printed stamps, they made movies about Bandera, they had celebration of him. Actually, every year as he was killed on 15 October, they had celebration on around 15 October. They were composed the celebration of a political part and of a church service. Actually, they started with a church service, and after the church service, there was a political part. So the children of these people sang songs for Bandera, or they recite poems about Bandera. They put on costumes of the Cossacks or of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and presented some anti-Soviet songs or Bandera songs. Yes, so they also organized marches in Washington, in London, in Munich. They wanted to rename a street in Munich to Bandera, but the city administration of Munich did not agree to this proposal. They created a Bandera museum in London, and they created a Bandera cult and contributed to it were the radical part of the Ukrainian diaspora, but the cult was present actually in the entire Ukrainian diaspora, or almost all parts of the Ukrainian diaspora were involved in Bandera or regarded him as an important anti-Soviet fighter.
Yeah, on in your book, you had this really great quote that I thought I would read, and that kind of speaks to this, because you mentioned that that facts about Bandera's life underwent a process of collective amnesia regarding the darker side of the OUN and UPA on the part of veterans of this movement. And I think that one of the themes that we like to talk on this podcast is the way that there is that a certain kind of like political and politicized amnesia gets used to try to sort of basically revise or promote a form of historical revisionism about whether it's the Soviet period, the various nationalisms. And so what did this collective amnesia of the darker sides of Ukrainian nationalism look like? How did that happen? And who was promoting it and why?
Yeah, This is an interesting question, and it is So to have a Bandera cult and to have a cult of another leader like Roman Szuchewicz, who was even more involved in the Holocaust and the killing of the Poles, you have to you need a very particular history of these people. So you can say that Bandera was a fascist after 1945, or you can say that he was an anti-Semite after 1945, or that he was involved in the Holocaust, because people would say that then if he was involved in the Holocaust, or he was a fascist or an anti-Semite, then he can't be an important leader, or he can be an important hero. And to establish a cult of Bandera, you need to tell only a part of the story and the politicized part of the story. So you can tell that Bandera was fighting against the Poles or that he was fighting against the Soviet Union, but you can't tell that he was fighting against the Jews or wanted to clean Ukraine of the Jews, or that he wanted to have a fascist Ukrainian state, because this is something which would jeopardize his cult. And that is how the cults of leaders are created during the Cold War period. Before 1945, it was a part of the discourse. So all the people in Germany knew that Adolf Hitler was an anti-Semite and that he wanted to kill the Jews, and they were not disturbed by this fact. But after 1945, it is different. Maybe the neo-Nazis in Germany, they still believe this, but you can't have a cult of Bandera or Duce if you say anti-Semitism was a central part of his ideology, because then many people would say, if anti-Semitism was a central part of his ideology, then why he should be a leader, or why should I understand him as a hero that is against democracy? And many other things are involved. So after World War II, I mean, Holocaust was not researched for a long time, but people knew about the Holocaust, about the concentration camps, and democracy became stronger in Western Europe. And the Ukrainian diaspora lived in Western European countries. So, for example, in Canada or in Australia, where we had the politics of multiculturalism, the Ukrainian diaspora who created the Bandera cult got a lot of money from the Canadian government, from the Australian government, and they used this money to create the Bandera cult, to create the cult of Roman Shuhevich, to create cults of anti-Semites, of fascists. But at the same time, they did not mention all this important information in public. They said only that Roman Shuhevich was an important anti-Soviet fighter, but not a people who killed the Jews.
To clarify, you mean that the sort of Ukrainian diaspora that was promoting the Bandera cult were basically using their relative freedoms and positions in the Western societies to promote a form of collective amnesia and historical revisionism regarding the actual activities and politics of Bandera and the Ukrainian nationalists.
Yes, this is what happened in all the countries, but in different forms. So, for example, in Australia and Canada, the politics of multiculturalism were important because of this politics, they got a lot of money. They could build a statue to Bandera. They could build, some kind of a cultural center, and to have a Bandera monument in this center, or to organize the Bandera celebration in this cultural center. And in other parts, actually in all the countries during the Cold War, anti-communism was very important, because claiming that they were anti-communist, it legitimized their aims. So they could get they could get money from the governments, but they could also present themselves in the public, saying that the UPA was an anti-Soviet army was something understood positively, actually, by all the people in the Western countries. And it is why we have this confusion that many people in Western Europe during the Cold War believed that the OUN and UPA were Democrats. So even Ronald Reagan and other American presidents welcomed Jaroslav Stisco, so the person who proclaimed the state in 1941 and who wanted to kill the Jews in Ukraine, as a democratic leader, as a leader of a democratic anti-Soviet movement. This was possible because of the Cold War.
Yeah, this was, of course, the next topic I was interested in. It was the way that some of the anti-communist sentiments of the late Cold War legitimized this type of historical revisionism. And I guess you kind of answered it, but then that leads to the next part, which is when the Soviet Union actually collapses, how does that Western anti-communist legitimization of the Ukrainian nationalism help encourage or legitimize it in the eyes of post-Soviet Ukrainians, and how does that play a role in the facilitation of the reemergence of a formal Bandera cult in the newly independent Ukraine after the end of the Soviet Union?
Mhm. Yes, so now we are going to the present. It is the Ukrainian diaspora. They realized in the late 1980s that there appears another Bandera cult in Western Ukraine. So the people, the dissidents in Western Ukraine, they create their own Bandera cult. And they now understand not only we have a Bandera cult, there is another cult of Bandera in Western Ukraine. And they are going to Ukraine in the early 1990s. Ukraine is proclaimed as a state in 1991, and they support the people in Ukraine who want to have a Bandera cult, who want to have a cult of the OUN, of the UPA, and they support the radical right parties, and they support also historians who write their own selective history of Ukraine. And the Bandera cult appears only in Western Ukraine. So we have this only in this part of Ukraine, which was in the Habsburg Empire, and it was in Poland, and in which OUN and UPA existed. And it did not appear in Central and Eastern Ukraine, which was in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union. And the Bandera cult and the cults of Shuhevich and of the OUN and UPA, they destabilize politically Ukraine, because what we have, the people during the Cold War, so in the Soviet Ukraine, they were exposed to a very hostile anti-Bandera, anti-OUN propaganda. And in Central and Eastern Ukraine, they believed this and believe this until today. And in many ways, this propaganda was true, although it exaggerated and was not interested in facts. And the people in Western Ukraine, they started to create a Bandera cult. And we had something like during World War I. We have two people in one state. We have people in Western Ukraine which want to have a different kind of state than the people in Central and Eastern Ukraine. And there is also Russia, which sees this. We have also Putin, who sees this and uses this destabilization, who supports the Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine, who see this confusion, and who has this imperial interest and wants to have Ukraine independent of Russia.
Yeah, that's interesting because not only was there a Bandera cult, but there was also a bifurcated view within Ukraine of who Bandera was, and you also had these like opposing kind of cults of Bandera, which is really interesting. That not only could we make the argument that Ukrainian nationhood, based on these very distinct historical experiences, were different and oppositional, and then that gets exploited by all kinds of powers, obviously. But that even Bandera himself and the meaning of Ukrainian nationalism in the West also has like opposing views and understandings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we have two different understanding of Bandera in Ukraine: a positive one in Western Ukraine, especially in Galicia, and a negative one in Central and Eastern Ukraine. And the Bandera museums. Yes.
And this leads me to the next question, which is that as post-Soviet Ukraine over the past 30 years has had to, like other post-communist and post-Soviet countries, basically institute a politics of memory to nation build, right? With all of these contradictions, how has Bandera played a role in that institutionalization of a new national memory in the aftermath of Soviet collapse? And how has that both been successful and unsuccessful? I know, for example, in Georgia, right, there is hugely contested view on the memory of Stalin, which is a different topic entirely. But I'm curious, but there's a lot of reverence for Stalin in Georgia, and there's a lot of people who try to use that against certain segments of the population to exclude them from nation building. Right, the people who are poor, or whomever, who revere Stalin for various reasons. One of the reasons is because the Soviet past has not been reconciled in Georgia, but in any serious way. It's just come under attack. There's been no serious attempt at making sense of, the parts of the Soviet story that people genuinely miss and revere. So I'm curious, like in the Ukrainian context, how has this Bandera cult related to the formal institutionalization of new memory in Ukrainian nation building, and how has that succeeded, failed? How has that, had contradictions? What does it mean in your view?
Mhm. Yeah, so it is a very difficult question, especially in terms of Bandera. As I studied Bandera in the beginning of this millennium, so there was a positive cult of Bandera only in Western Ukraine. So the museums of Bandera were built only in Western Ukraine. So the statues of Bandera, the monuments of Bandera were built only in Western Ukraine. Streets to Bandera were only created in Western Ukraine, and it was a local cult. The state was not involved in in promoting the Bandera cult. But later, as President Yushchenko became the president of Ukraine, so he hired the people from Western Ukraine, historians from Western Ukraine, who were supported by the Ukrainian diaspora and who established the Ukrainian cult in Western Ukraine to control the politics of memory in entire Ukraine. An important historian was Volodymyr Wiatrovich, who wrote a very apologetic, actually anti-Semitic book about the UPA. And he was the leader, or one of the leaders, of the directors of this Institute of Political Memory. And yeah, what they tried to do was to establish a Bandera cult and other cults of Shuhevich, of the OUN, UPA, in entire Ukraine. So also in central and eastern parts of Ukraine, where the people were hostile to Bandera and the OUN. And they obviously failed, but they tried to do this, and they destabilize the political situation in Ukraine. And there were many different changes, because when Yushchenko declared Bandera to be the hero of Ukraine, and he declared other nationalists and fascists like Roman Shuhevich to be the Ukrainian hero. And when he stopped to be the president, this was withdrew. So there were many changes during the last 10 and 20 years. But we have now a Bandera street in Kiev. I don't know. It was established in 2016, but there is still no positive attitude to Bandera in Kiev. I don't think the people in Kiev regard Bandera as a hero or an important political person. But you see, we had governments during the last 20 years who tried to establish Bandera as a hero of Ukraine, and we had politicians who were against this, or who even promoted a very different understanding of Ukraine. And there is also something like the cult of Stalin in eastern parts of Ukraine. It has it is much lower scope than in Georgia or in other republics, but there are some communist organizations who feud who understand Stalin as a leader. There were even some small monuments opened for Stalin in Ukraine. The most important problem in this is that the politicians and the historians in Ukraine lack the understanding of democracy. They do not know how to write the history of Ukraine in a democratic way, and especially the history of the OUN or Bandera in a democratic way. They have this politicized understanding of the Ukrainian history, either in the very positive or in the negative sense, but they do not really understand how to write the history of Ukraine, especially of World War II, the history of Ukrainian fascism, the history of communism in a democratic way. So in a way which would few regard as the most important part the suffering of the population, and which would take seriously the anti-Semitism, the crimes committed by the nationalists or by the communists. There is a lot of apology for different political ideas and ideologies, but at the moment I do not really see historians in Ukraine, with the exception of maybe some younger people, who write or try to write the history of Ukraine in a democratic way.
This segues into the next topic that I wanted to address with you, which was your experience as a historian on such a topic. And I have two questions. And the first one is, this is a really sensitive topic. It's highly politicized. And I'm curious, like, how was your experience publishing this research? How was it received? Was it attacked, right? And did you have problems? And what was that experience like? And then I guess related to that is, what do you think the role of the historian should be?
Yes. Yes. So as I was doing the research, I didn't have problems because I could visit the museums, I could work in the archives, but I didn't really say in public what I think of Bandera. Maybe I published one or two articles at the moment, but some people in the archives knew maybe in the late period of my research, they knew who I am, but they didn't make me any difficulties, and I could work. The situation changed as I was. When was it? It was in 2012. Early 2012, I was invited to deliver some lectures about Bandera in Lviv, in Kiev, and in Dnipropetrovsk. It was the German embassy, the Bildsstiftung, and the German exchange service who invited me. And it was impossible to organize a lecture about Bandera in 2012 in Lviv. The lectures in Dnipropetrovsk were cancelled, and there was only one lecture about Bandera in Kiev in the German embassy. And there were many demonstrants of the Svoboda. It was the Svoboda party at the time, which was very powerful, and who called the universities and said, there will be no presentation about Bandera in this facility, because otherwise we do this and this. And these lectures were cancelled. And sometimes, like in Lviv, the academics themselves canceled the lectures because they were afraid of what can happen. It was only this one lecture in Kiev. And yeah, it was a good lecture. So there were long discussion about the lecture, and people who came were interested in the subject. Many academics, historians, and students. We had a very interesting conversation with these people. Very interesting discussions. But yeah, then the book was published in 2014 in English. Then it was translated into Polish, and in late 2021 it appeared in Ukrainian and in Russian. And actually, it was shortly before Putin attacked Ukraine. Took a long time to translate them into Ukrainian and Russian. And the reactions to the book were mainly positive. So there were many positive reviews, especially in the academic papers. There were some hostile reviews from the Ukrainian diaspora and some confused scholars. But something like 70 or 80% of the reviews in the academic publications, perhaps even more than 70 or 90, perhaps 80 or 90% were positive. And yeah, it had impact on the academia, I think. There was the hostile reactions came from Ukraine. So it was first ignored in Ukraine. The Ukrainian scholars say, it is not important for us. This man is not a scholar. He's some kind of a confused politician who tries to be a scholar, But it was the reactions from Ukraine. But the reactions from scholars interested in the history of the Holocaust or fascism or Ukraine or in Central Europe, they were positive. And what is said is that the Russian and Ukrainian translation were published so late. So they were done in late 2021 by the publisher Anton Pugacz, announced it only in the middle of February 2022. And it was something like 2 weeks before Putin attacked Ukraine. He didn't want to announce it before because he was afraid that the Ukrainian government would withdraw these publications from the market. That he wanted first to make sure that they are in the bookshops, that people can actually buy them on internet or in the bookshops, and then to announce this. But it was late. Some 2 or 3 weeks later, Putin attacked Ukraine, and there was no discussion about the book in Ukraine and in Russia.
I think that in the case of post-Soviet Georgia, one of the main issues that I myself come across that we try to address in this podcast is this tension that exists between historical memory, or I should say, between memory and history. They are overlapping, they share, but they are also quite different. There is also a politics of history and there is a politics of memory. And so in your book, I think that one part I really liked was that you try and navigate this as a historian, right? How can I investigate simultaneously the politics of memory or the memory of Bandera and this person who was a historical figure produced by a specific historical or socio-political ecosystem, right? That had an influence in the world as an individual, but also represented a tendency, a sentiment, and a movement. And so, how do you understand the relationship between history and memory? And what do you think is the task of the historian in engaging with the politics of memory?
Yes, yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, good question. And it was something, yeah, which I, yeah, tried to make clear in Bandera, and was, as I said, the main challenge for writing the Bandera book, because Bandera is a part of the politics of memory in many states, in Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland, and in other countries. But at the same time, he's a historical figure, an important historical actor. And writing the biography, I discovered things I did not expect because they did not appear in the publication which were at that time. So you couldn't read this in this publication published by an Institute of Political Memory of Ukraine, or I know some historians in Poland, which did not really and did not really study the documents in the archives. And it is important for historians to write the actual history of the events and of figures like Bandera, and to write it in a democratic way. So the audience can inform themselves who these people were, what the events were, and what the people who work in some institutes of I don't know, collective memory or public memory do is another way, because they usually work closely with some political parties or governments. And they promote different understandings of history. And we have this, we watched it especially in Poland in the last year. So Poland had a good research about the Holocaust, what is leading countries of the Holocaust research in the last 20 years. But then the Peace Party took power in Poland, and at least in the public, it changed a lot, because they released historians who did good research about the Holocaust and wrote decent books about the Holocaust, and they leave this to people who were in fascist organizations or who had no understanding of history, only because this activist, this political activist, were willing to do what the party expected. And in the case of Bandera, it is quite complicated because we have different political groups in Ukraine who promote a different understanding of Bandera, and also in Russia or in Poland. And it is what I say, the actual history is so important. We need academic books which inform the readers about the actual events. So as it happened, for example, with the Holocaust or in fascism in the last 5 decades in most countries. So historians studied Holocaust, explain many aspects, not all of the aspects of the Holocaust. By people interested in the Holocaust, they can go to the library and they can read about Auschwitz, they can read about hunting of the Jews, they can read about helping for the Jews, and they have the books written by academics whose most important aim was to discover what actually happened and not to present some political kind of history. And in the case of Bandera, it was for a long time not so. And it is why today so many historians in Ukraine and ordinary people in Ukraine are confused about Bandera and don't see the difference between a historical biography of Bandera and some kind of political propaganda book.
And maybe my only response, or maybe a small response to what you just said, is you've mentioned this idea of writing a democratic history that can overcome certain politicization of history. But one of the things I'm looking at is that in the post-Soviet world, um, and in the post-communist world, um, history is so politicized at even the highest political levels of each nation state, or as in one of our previous interviews when we interviewed Laurie Neumeyer, a French political scientist, um, she writes about these memory entrepreneurs who basically, in their desire to legitimate the Europeanness of their own countries, they've then tried to relitigate the memory of things like the Holocaust, and the things like the communist or Soviet period, in order to justify themselves as being part of the European memory regime. And so, like in the way that the Soviet past is navigated in post-Soviet Georgia, one thing that I've come across is that they've kind of tried to justify Europeanness by importing sort of a memory regime about the Soviet past in Georgia that's kind of very distinct or divergent from the actual experience of most Georgians and how they experienced and think about what that past was. So it creates this kind of hyper politicized and almost, I want to say, kind of schizophrenic view of the past. Where on the one hand everything was good, but on the other hand everything was horrible, not because it was horrible, but because of the politics of why it should have been. And very intimately related to this process of trying to justify, Western integration, Europeanization, and geopolitical tensions with Russia. Also having to do with the fact that in the post-Soviet period, and again, I'm just trying to connect it to the Georgian situation, in the post-Soviet period, the Russian Federation was recognized as the sole inheritor of the Soviet past. So in Georgia, when they have a war with Russia, for example, it's almost politically impossible in the public sphere to justify some kind of positive sentiment about the Soviet past, when internationally and in the post-Soviet world, well, who was the Soviet Union? Well, it was Russia. Well, that's not the actual memory, that democratic memory of the Soviet past, but that democratic memory is actually unable to be transmitted in a political way because of all these other factors that are, like you say, non-democratic. So I guess, like, the question is, like, when you've got all these contradictions and you've got all these various forces at play, like, how does one overcome the and again, when you also have these anti-democratic history regimes and memory regimes being sold to the populations as being democratic, how do you overcome these dynamics as a historian, and how do you write, maybe this can be the last question, a democratic history?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are so many discourses about Bandera and other things. You can't really follow them. I tried to follow them as I was writing the biography because it was important, but I didn't really follow all the discourses about Bandera during the last 10 years, because, as I said, there are many political parties and many political groups, not only in Ukraine but also in Russia, in the Ukrainian diaspora, who present their own narratives on who claim to have the truth about Bandera. I mean, it is not easy to uh, to to be a historian. I mean, you have to study first for a long time, then you have to specialize in a subject, which takes also a long period of time. It is why there are not so many historians, for example, of, I don't know, even if we take something like the Holocaust, there are maybe 20 or 30 person around the world who study the Holocaust. The same may be in a serious way. There may be the same with the Soviet Union, maybe 30 or 50 person who study the Soviet Union in a serious way. When we take Bandera, there would be what would be only me, and would be uh, uh, some people who study related subjects like the Ukrainian nationalists, like the Holocaust in Ukraine, and so on. And when you become historian, then it goes on. So I first published a book on Bandera, and it was a long process. It was research, took me something like 4 or 5 years, and then the writing the book took me also something like 4 or 5 years, and then publishing the articles was a long process. These are long processes. So investigate something, it is a very complex way. So investigate something in an academic way, because you have to look at the sources, to go to the archives, and doing this, then you have the understanding what is history, what is the difference between history and the public memory or politics of memory. And now writing the book about the Polish males in the general government during World War II, it was also a very long process. It took me also something altogether, perhaps like 10 years. And this is the difference. A person who writes some kind of a short book, works some kind of government institutions, or I don't know, some kind of institute closely related to the government. It is something like a process of 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe a month, to publish a brochure or publish a book but these are two different things: to investigate something as a historian, and to publish something which affects the memory of a nation.
Más, miłale se utary, lopsu parunych glaus, storem kalia I sode, cała gachła basła,